Welcome back to part 2 of my deep dive into the 4th generation Focusrite Scarlett. This video is all about the Hitmaker Expansion, which is the free bundle of audio tools included with every new Focusrite audio interface. Here we have the session recorded entirely through the Scarlett, produced and mixed with nothing other than the included plugins from the bundle, a couple of freebies, and my DAW of choice, Logic Pro. For those who are new, DAW just means Digital Audio Workstation. The Hitmaker Expansion does come with access to 2 different DAWs, Pro Tools and Ableton. However, it's only a 3-month long subscription to Pro Tools, and then you have to pay for it. And the version of Ableton is pared down to the point that you will outgrow it. If it were me, then I would just go ahead and get a more robust option out of the gate if music production is something that you plan to stick with. I use Logic. It's easy for me because I've been using it since version 8. However, what you choose will largely be based on opinion and taste. Visual aids, customization, and workflow are really the main things that separate DAWs these days, as you can pretty much accomplish the same things with all of them, just in slightly different ways. So do your own research and see what makes the most sense for you. I will note that during the production of this video, Universal Audio has made its own workstation called Luna available for free to all Mac users. Admittedly, it looks like it's partially a storefront for its paid plugins. However, the DAW itself is fully featured with unlimited track counts, full automation ability, and some free plugins as well. I haven't used it myself. I'm just throwing it out there just in case you're on a Mac and would like to give something free a shot. So for reference sake, I'm going to replay the short song that I made with the Scarlett once now, and then solo out the individual instruments as we critique and walk through each plugin. I'll also point out a few plugins that I kept reaching for, but had to remind myself to put them back in order to stay within the parameters for this video. So let's get started. Here we have our session showcasing many of the plugins from the Hitmaker Expansion. We have our audio tracks. This is comprised of drum tracks, bass guitar, clean guitar, distorted guitar, and we got verse vocals and chorus vocals. Then we have our MIDI tracks. These feature the Addictive Drums, which is included in the bundle. Talk about those in a minute. Then we have auxiliary tracks and buses. These are for things such as reverbs, delays, and parallel compression. And then we have our main outputs. I'm going to break this video down by plugin, so let's start with the most used and maybe the most confusing looking plugin to those of us new to music production, the Focusrite console emulation plugin. This is an emulation of a large format analog console that you would see in a pro studio. Famously, one of these consoles was featured at Jack Joseph Puig's mix room at Ocean Way Studios. And again, if you're brand new to making music, then something like this might intimidate you and you might overlook it. But if you think of it as a few separate plugins all wrapped into one, then you can wrap your head around it a little easier. Since this is a console emulation, it's made to be used on many, if not all, of your audio tracks. So to understand this a little bit more, I'm going to open up something called Plugin Doctor, which is an external application that I can load this plugin into, and we can see how it affects the audio spectrum on a graph. So this graph here, think of this as like a blank equalizer. It goes from 0 hertz to over 20 kHz. So this covers the entire audible range of the human ear. And just by engaging the plugin, you can see that it's already adding a little bit of its own character. Now, since this is modeled on an analog piece of equipment, it's modeling the noise characteristics. See, if I turn up the V gain, you get more noise, and you can see how it affects the frequency spectrum. And then these numbers here represent something called TMT Inside, which is proprietary to Brainworks, who made this plugin. These represent the different channels of a mixing console. The idea is to put this across all of your audio tracks and then change this per channel so that each channel is slightly different from one another. So this plugin provides EQ, gating, compression, and de-essing. These are all standard features that you would find on a fully outfitted channel strip on a console. So this section here is our EQ. It has a high shelf and a low shelf. And as you can see, the low shelf changes the low frequencies of our spectrum, and the high shelf changes the high frequencies of our spectrum. And then the high shelf and the low shelf have controls which change where the frequencies start to boost or cut. So as you can see, as I move this knob, the frequency boosts become higher, and the same thing can be said for the low shelf. Then we have two peaking bands here. So this one covers the low frequencies to the mid bands, and then this one covers the mid frequencies to the upper frequencies. And then if I hit this ×3 button, you can see that it just goes up ×3 from where it was. And then you have the same feature in the bass. So then we have our high pass filter and our low pass filter. And as you can see, even by turning them on, it affects the frequency spectrum. The low pass filter goes from 20K down to 3.9K. However, I have a divide button here, which goes down even further. And then the bottom has the same thing, except in the opposite direction. Then over here, we have our gate feature. And the gate would typically be used on, say, a snare drum or a kick drum to keep any microphone bleed out of that channel. So here we have our snare track. And I will take the gate out. And you can hear that kick drum mic bleeding into the signal. If I engage the gate, you can hear that the kick drum is basically gone. It's useful on many instruments, but it's most obvious on a kick or snare drum. So then we have our compressor, and I can make a whole hour-long video about compression, so I'm not gonna go down that road. But let's just say that this is a fully outfitted compressor, complete with threshold, release, attack, makeup gain, ratio, and a mix knob, which you definitely won't find on an analog console. This goes from no compression to 100% compression, and this gives you access immediately to something called parallel compression, meaning the dry signal blended in with the compressed signal. So I'll talk about the de-esser in a second, but first let's look at this section down here. And these are just filters that go into the gate and compressor sections in order to adjust their behavior, their characteristics. So for instance, suppose I wanted to filter out everything below 100 Hertz going into the compressor. I would hit this button and it lights up yellow, and that lets me know that I'm sending everything above 100 Hertz into that compressor, and everything below 100 Hertz is being ignored by the compressor. So we have a high pass filter, a low pass filter, and a peak band, which you can use to push or pull away frequencies going into either the gate or the compressor. And these three buttons just control which filter is going where. So it's either off, going to the compressor alone, going to the gate alone, going to both the compressor and the gate, or it could be actually in the audible audio signal. Okay, so going back to Plugin Doctor, let's look at the de-esser. De-essers are supposed to take away sibilance, mostly from vocal recordings. They can be used to tame harshness or piercing frequencies in overheads, drum overheads. They can be useful on distorted guitars, etc. This de-esser is okay, it does an okay job, but I would have liked to have a few more controls over how it reacts. Either way, it has a listen button, and what this does is it jacks up whatever frequency this frequency knob is focused on. And as you can see over here, this is what you use to find the offending frequencies. And then of course you would disengage this and take the signal down. Or if you want to accentuate that frequency, then you can use this as an expander, and instead of removing that frequency, it amplifies it. So then here we just have our input and our output. You basically just want to make sure that you watch your levels here. They don't get too hot, too red. Unless it sounds good and that's what you're after, that's fine. Okay, I hope that cleared some things up. Let's move on to the rest of the plugins. I'm gonna look at Addictive Drums. I used this 3 times on the drum set. So the tracks in a darker brown are the audio drum tracks. The tracks in a lighter brown are the MIDI tracks. Now every DAW has its own way of doing this. I'm pretty sure all DAWs do it at this point, but I converted the audio signal into MIDI so that I'm able to trigger some samples inside of Addictive Drums. Now the reason that I do this is because in my room I can get some nice dry punchy drum sounds, but I'm not going to get much in terms of a roomy sound. So I can get that artificially either through reverb, which I have done, and I'll show that in a moment with the Relab LX480, but you can also get it by use of samples of a real drum space. So if I play the drums back by themselves, it's not bad, but it's very dry. I'm going to add in the Addictive Drums samples that I've used. You get a roomier sound, but it's still controlled. So there's different libraries that you can buy for Addictive Drums, but the Focusrite comes with one called Studio Rock, and it gets you going out of the box. And as I've said, I've used 3 instances of this plugin. One to create a drum room. One to give some strength to the kick drum. So as you can hear, that kick sample is very present, not a lot of low end. I got the low end from my actual microphone. Add them both together, you get a pretty solid kick drum sound. Then I used one more instance of this plugin on the snare drum, but I used it in a different way. Inside of Addictive Drums, it has this little white noise sample. And you can pretty much add that to a snare drum to give it some more presence. I'll use that word. So if you listen to the snare drum by itself, sounds pretty good, but it's just the top snare mic. Add in the noise track. It almost sounds like a bottom snare drum mic. And on the edit page of Addictive Drums, you can tailor the attack and the release of this noise burst. So you do that with the volume envelope. See, if I take that out of the equation, it doesn't fit the song. But when I add that in, it's following the tempo of the song. Now this song is at 162 beats per minute, and I know that a quarter note equals 370 milliseconds. So basically what I did was I took 186 milliseconds of decay time in this volume envelope and a release time of 184 milliseconds, both equal 370. And if you're asking yourself, how do I know that? Well, there's this very handy site that I use by anotherproducer.com. And on this site, it has a delay and reverb time calculator. So you just put in the tempo of your track, and it gives you the note values in terms of milliseconds of your song. So here you can see 1 quarter note equals 370 milliseconds. So shout out to them. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up Addictive Drums for this song. Now, as I said, I did also use reverb on the drum set, and to do that, I used the Relab LX480. This has a bigger brother plugin that you can pay for, but this is the one that comes free with the Focusrite. For a free version, it definitely covers a lot of ground. Relab have made a very authentic emulation of the Lexicon 480, which is a piece of hardware that came out in the 80s, and it's a reverb that has been heard on thousands of hit songs. In this specific version, you can switch from a room sound to ambiance to hall to plate. So pretty much if you're unfamiliar with reverb plugins, you can pretty much just scroll through the preset menu and then you can tailor the sound using these controls down here. Since I have this on a bus, it's 100% wet, meaning it's all reverb. And I gave some more width to my drums using this plugin. Add in the sampled room mics. with the entire kit. You can hear that it adds some nice width and a little bit of depth. I also used the LX480 on the guitars. Used it on the vocals.
When I think about it, we might be replacing televisions in an old suitcase.
And then I used a separate instance in the vocals on the chorus because I wanted a shorter decay time in the chorus, and then I also wanted to follow it up with a de-esser. This de-esser is from Logic, so pretty much every DAW has its own de-esser now. So as you can see, it really crushes those S's, which I don't want on the reverb tail in the chorus vocals.
I don't want a computer to sing my song.
Okay, so that covers the LX480. Oh, and by the way, I have Acustica Audio Silver. I have the LX480 emulations in that, and this one isn't that much different from those. Every emulation is going to be slightly different. You know, you could get into the argument that one is better than the other, but they're all pretty much gonna give you close results, especially in the context of a mix. So to round out our drum sound, I also have a parallel compression bus. Now, as I mentioned earlier, parallel compression is just when you blend in a compressed signal with the original signal. In the case of the drums, you're going to parallel compress pretty hard, meaning you're going to apply a lot of compression on that parallel bus. So I have my kick drum, my kick sample, my snare drum, my room sample, and my overhead mics going to the parallel bus. So I'm using the Focusrite Red 3 compressor, and famously Chris Lord-Alge has this compressor strapped across his mix bus. So it's been heard on many, many, many modern songs, but I'm going to talk about the mix bus separately in a moment. And as you can see, it's compressing pretty hard. Add that in with the dry signal though. It gives it a lot of strength. Take it out. It doesn't sound as solid when you mute that. Now, you don't want to make the compressed signal too loud and have it compete with the original signal. You just want to tuck it underneath the original signal because otherwise it's going to sound too compressed. I'm using the Red 2 EQ as well before the compressor just to push some more low end and a little bit more high end into the compressor. This is an optional thing you can do. You don't have to use an EQ before the compressor on the parallel bus, but it adds a little bit of excitement. So on the bass guitar, I just used the Focusrite console onto the guitars. On every guitar, I have the Marshall Silver Jubilee, which is a plugin made by Softtube. So I actually have a real Marshall JCM 800, and I know that's different from the Silver Jubilee a little bit, but the sound of this plugin is definitely distinctively Marshall. Amplifier modeling in general has come a long way these days, and it's not necessarily the sound of the amplifier models that is the issue for me, but it lies in the way that they play and the way that they react to the guitar. Playing through a real amplifier is still a much different experience in my opinion, and those differences do translate to the way that your guitar will sound in the mix, because there's not much in the way of playing off the amp, if you know what I mean. However, the raw sound of this plugin is very good, in my opinion. I used it on the clean guitars. So you can hear I have one guitar panned hard left and right, and they're playing off of each other. So I actually have two guitar parts in the chorus, two distorted guitars. One just doing octaves. And then I have one doing chords. And I'm using slightly different amplifier settings on each of them, followed by a channel EQ, just cutting out some of that mid-range that was kind of whistling a little bit. Using this EQ plugin isn't exactly cheating because every DAW has a parametric EQ like this, and then every guitar gets a Focusrite console as well. So here's the guitars together. So as far as the vocals go, I pretty much did most of the heavy lifting with the Focusrite console. However, I did run into an issue, and this is because I overused the Harmonic drive air mode. Since this whole thing is kind of an experiment for me, I used the Harmonic drive on every vocal track, and I kind of wish I just used it on maybe one layer of the chorus vocals and just stuck to that, and then just use the regular preamp for the rest of the vocals, because it really hypes up that high end, and then you have to lean on things like the de-esser, kind of pull it back, rein it in a little bit as best you can with these tools. As I've already mentioned, I'm not like the hugest fan of the de-esser in this plugin. And the one that I really like is the Acoustica Audio Fire the DS, but that's paid for, and it's outside of the parameters of this video. So in the chorus especially, I had to rely on straight static parametric EQ to kind of pull back some of those hyped frequency areas. So yeah, there was a lot of energy around 5K that I pulled back, 10K, a little irritation around 1.3. So yeah, just be careful with that harmonic drive because you can certainly overdo it. I did use the doubler. This is the Sonnox VoxDoubler included in the bundle. And this sounds surprisingly good, especially for a plugin you don't have to pay for when you buy the Focusrite. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that it's an emulation of the Eventide H3000, which is widely heard on many songs. So the verse has its own bus with the vocal doubler on it, and then the chorus vocals have its own bus as well.
When I think about it, we might be
panned right down the middle, and then in the chorus,
I don't want a computer to sing my song.
You can hear that it opens up. Now, what I forgot to mention is that I also used this on the Addictive Drums room mics. So the straight samples sound a little bit boring, dry, just straight down the middle. Adding this vocal doubler on the drums, it almost gives it some slapback. Now there's also another plugin that Sonnox has included called VoxDoubler Thicken. This was a little bit too much for this song, so I did not use that. Okay, so on to the output bus, the mix bus. So this is just the stereo output that all of the tracks are funneled into. Like I said, I have the Red 3 compressor, and this is not hitting it very hard at all. Sort of just softening the blow of those heavy impacts. Then I have it followed up with the BX Master Desk. I would describe this plugin as a mastering processor for musicians. There's not a ton of control that this plugin offers, but it's easy to make it sound good, and it's kind of tough to screw it up. So, to show you what I mean, let's open up Plugin Doctor again. So this plugin does not have the typical controls that you would find on a mastering compressor or a mastering equalizer or a limiter. Instead, it has a tone stack that you might find on a guitar amplifier and a one knob compressor, which I actually didn't use. I used the Red 3. It has a one knob de-esser that de-esses your entire mix. It has resonance filters, so if your song has a lot of buildup at 160 hertz, for example, it'll cut that completely, as you can see in the graph. And the same thing goes for 315 hertz. These are just typical areas where a lot of buildup can happen. Or if your mix is harsh, you can cut 3150. Or if your mix is piercing, you can cut this devil's frequency up here. Then you have a foundation knob, and what this does is it shifts the focus from the low energy to the high energy, or vice versa. So if your mix was very bassy, you could just use this one knob to shift all the low frequencies down. If you had a very thin sounding mix, you could use this knob to move up the bass frequencies and lower the high frequencies. Now, just engaging the plugin rolls off the extreme lows and the extreme highs. It has a mono maker control, meaning that everything below the number on the dial will be in mono. This is actually very useful to keep a nice solid low end. And conversely, you can enhance your higher frequencies with the stereo enhancer. Just don't go too hard, because then you will ruin your mono compatibility. And the tone stack works pretty good. It's very subtle. So if I jacked up the mid-range, for example, you can see that even when it's fully pinned, it doesn't accentuate that area too crazy. But yeah, you're not going to get that control that you would from other processors. And then of course you have a volume knob, which raises the entire volume of your mix. Now, just to make sure I didn't raise the volume too much, I have a metering plugin that is part of Logic. And now what I'm looking for is that integrated loudness to be around -14 for streaming services, or if your mix is asking for it, you make it a lot louder, but it's going to be turned down when it's played back on Spotify or YouTube Music or something. And then Logic also has this handy plugin called AU Round Trip AAC. I'm pretty sure most DAWs have something like this now, where you could actually listen to it back as though it's already been encoded to the AAC format, which is what most streaming services use now. So I listen back to this because I want to make sure that after it's encoded, it's not going to peak, it's not going to clip. So even though it's not clipping when it's at 24 or 32-bit, it might clip after it's encoded. Listen back to the whole song after you're done through this thing, and if you're clipping, then all you gotta do is turn down the volume a little bit until it doesn't. One more free plugin that I used is called K-Clip 0 by Kazrog. And what this is it's a free clipping plugin, and I used it on the kick drum and the snare drum. And for those of you who are new out there, clipping is typically used after a compressor, sometimes before it. Most of the time I use it after. And what this does is, suppose you got a lot of snare hits and they're very consistent, and then one is just really loud and it gets through that compressor. So the compressor allows through kind of a harsh transient. The clipping plugin will then catch that transient and just lop it off. So it prevents that transient from bothering you, pretty much. So the Hitmaker expansion does cover a lot of ground, but I did have to use that one free plugin. But I did mention that I'm going to talk about a few things that I did keep reaching for, but had to remind myself to stay within the parameters of this video, so I put them back. And that's a tape emulation. The one I use is for Nebula, which is made by Acoustic Audio. But IK Multimedia, they make a great one. Universal Audio, obviously. I'll even use the Slate Digital one, which is now almost 12 years old. I'll use that occasionally as well, especially on like a reverb return when I don't want to use a lot of CPU power. I'll just throw that on there, soften up the reverb a little bit. Another type of plugin that I really would have liked to use is a dynamic EQ, which is basically a compressor that only acts on a very specific frequency area. There was some spikiness on the guitars at times that I would have liked to suppress with a dynamic EQ, as opposed to pull down completely with a static EQ. Dynamic EQs can be found on plugins such as Pro Q3, but there's also specialized tools such as Soothe and DSEQ by TB Pro Audio. Those are two really good ones. Also, I would have liked to have access to a high quality saturation plugin. Adding a slight amount of distortion to many signals can be pleasing to the ear. And if your saturation plugin is able to oversample by many times internally, then you can push the digital artifacts mostly out of the audible range of the spectrum. Right now, I pretty much turn to Acoustica Audio for saturation. Their Jam plugin is great, and the recent Pumpkin and Pumpkin Pro are also very good. However, I did review the Waves Magma bundle on this channel, and that has a really good saturator as well. And honestly, I would have loved to use my own mix bus tools. I'm not used to using these tools. So I'm not saying these tools are bad, I'm just saying I don't have a lot of experience with them. But I am confident that if I spent more time with them, I could really get to know them well. So yeah, ultimately this was a very good experience for me. And for $200, I don't really see how you could go wrong with the Focusrite Scarlett 2i2. Even without the Hitmaker expansion, it's still a great interface. Well, anyways, for those of you who are new out there, I'm really glad that you found my channel, and I hope that I've shed some light on some of these tools if you're new to audio production. If you have any further questions, please ask them in the comment section below, and I thank you very much for tuning in today. Have fun making music, and I'll see you next time.